Welcome to this edition of American Purpose. My name is Jack Moline. I am the president of Interfaith Alliance. 60 years ago, Henry Luce, the publisher of Life magazine, invited 10 prominent men, each to compose an essay on the national purpose. Then, as now, there was a sense that we stood at the beginning of a time of cultural and political change. Our project expands on this work as each episode explores one perspective on where our nation was, where it is, and where it should be heading with a contemporary thought leader. My guests are from the worlds of faith, government, politics, and culture, and they have generously agreed to share this time with us. You can find out more about Interfaith Alliance and our mission to protect your faith and freedom at interfaithalliance.org and by listening to our radio program and podcast, State of Belief, at stateofbelief.com. But right now, let's find out more about the American purpose with my guest, William Kristol. You probably know him as a political commentator and as the editor of the once honorable and now defunct Weekly Standard. But he is also a lifelong student and interpreter of the American experience, and I am very excited to have him with me today. Bill, thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Jack, for having me. And I already have learned something from this discussion with you, because I have to go back and I vaguely remember hearing about that Henry Luce project, well, I guess it would have been, 1940, something like that, right?
1960,
before?
Actually.
1960.
Wow. Between Eisenhower and Kennedy.
Wow. I should go back and look at those essays. They're worth looking at, I assume?
They are definitely worth looking at. If for no other reason than they're a collection of remarkable people who wrote them, everyone from Archibald MacLeish and Clifton Fadiman to Billy Graham and David Sarnoff. It's a remarkable collection.
Good.
But let's dive into the questions. In your opinion, what was the original purpose of the United States of America?
A big question, but a fair one. So I'd say a couple of things. I mean, obviously, like any nation, it had some primary purposes that don't differ that much, whether you're a liberal democracy or a constitutional monarchy, or maybe even a sort of tribal authoritarian nation, which is the safety and security of its own citizens. And that's emphasized if you look at the Federalist Papers, which I would say is the best, maybe single place to look, apart from the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution themselves, the documents, the Federalist Papers, the commentary on the Constitution written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, and right after the Constitution, arguing for its ratification in 1787, 1788. The Federalist Papers don't shy away from saying, look, we need to defend ourselves. We need safety and security. We need a strong government for that reason. The Articles of Confederation didn't work, et cetera. So one shouldn't get too, before there are higher purposes for America, but there's also the basic fundamental purpose, and that remains important. But the higher purposes are stressed also obviously in the Declaration and the Constitution and the Federalist Papers. This is a nation based on certain principles and dedicated to achieving, or pursuing at least, seeking certain goals, equality for all of our citizens, equal rights, liberty, right to participate in government by consent of the governed, sort of the standard, but still important, very important, liberal goals, let's call them, from articulated by John Locke and many, many others moving forward, and that have spread around the world as the American founders intended. And that's the final point I would make. From the very beginning, the universal importance and meaning of America was in the founders' mind, very much in Lincoln's mind, obviously, when you read his speeches. So it's a bit of a myth these days. People say, well, America started off as a kind of isolationist nation, or a little 13 colonies here, far removed from Europe. And there's truth to that, of course, in some ways. But there was always the understanding that success here would mean something for everyone else, not just for the few millions of people, or few millions of white, non-Native American and mostly non-African American people, who were really protected by the original social contract here. It was always of universal importance as an example and as a light to other nations. And at times, and this changed over the decades and centuries, obviously also ability to help other nations secure these basic human rights and basic human dignity.
So, having said all of that, and that's a big bite for a young nation to take off.
Right.
What do you believe is or ought to be the American purpose going forward? Is it the same, or has it evolved?
It's such a good point about it being such a. I mean, you look back and you read it, and you're American, as we are, and so you're sort of used to this rhetoric in a way, and you then have to step back and say, I'm reading this in Federalist 1 or Federalist 37 or elsewhere. I mean, this is a nation of several million, just succeeded in liberating itself from Great Britain, but has no, is not a powerful nation, and you'd think they'd just be concerned about, let's just take care of ourselves here for a while and get things, going. And they right away understand that founding this nation based on consent of the governed, dedicated to preserving rights and liberty, really is something special. So, I think this remains the task. I think we are now a much wealthy and great nation, maybe the greatest power in the world. Maybe we are the single greatest power in the world. I think I'd say two things. Recent years have reminded us that you can't take liberty for granted, that just because we've succeeded in so many ways doesn't mean we couldn't still fail in the most important ways. And we have failed in so many ways through our history, incidentally, that should also be a reminder that sort of external success, power, prosperity doesn't mean that you necessarily secure equal rights or maintain the conditions for government by consent of the governed. And I do think just being so powerful also gives us much more of an obligation to other nations in the world. If you're a small nation, you have limited ability to shape outcomes elsewhere. This was debated early on in the history of the American Republic. Should we help revolutionaries in Europe? And there were actually interesting arguments on both sides. And it is interesting for me, to sort of get to your point, how even in 1804 with Jefferson, I think it was, or 1820s with Henry Clay, American statesmen at least thought that it wasn't crazy to think, well, we have some obligation to help people elsewhere doing what we're doing, even though practically speaking, it's hard to believe the young United States of America would have intervened, in a civil war in Europe in 1821 or something. But we did at least wish for the right outcome and try to help them in certain ways. But now, of course, it's a different situation, and I do think we do have real obligations abroad, not just to wish others who are seeking liberty well.
So your answer here provokes me to ask you something that isn't on what we initially decided to talk about. When America was founded, it was really very isolated from the nations that it sought interaction with. We were certainly not isolated from the rest of North America, but it was no more a player in the international community than the colonies were at that point. What has the sort of shrinking of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans meant in terms of that American vision?
So I think the simple answer, and I think the correct answer, is it's meant that we have different sets of obligations and opportunities than we would have had 200 years ago. And we shouldn't pretend that somehow an eloquent speech from 200 years ago that says, look, we've got to sort of worry about ourselves, maybe a certain amount of isolation is healthy, that necessarily applies. It's a fair argument to make, but that it necessarily applies today. But I would also say, just if you do look at America, I mean, I was struck by this recently, skimming through some foreign policy history, and we're engaged with the British and French. It's extremely controversial in American politics whether we should have a peace treaty with Britain or what we fight a war with Britain. They burned the White House famously in 1812. The degree to which a lot of the acquisition of territories here in America is from European nations and is driven by the sense that we have to clear these European competitors out or we'll be unstable ourselves. So the degree to which even then the kind of concern for foreign policy is striking. And I was talking to someone last night, this is totally random, but it's kind of interesting, who's been studying Melville. And when you read these Americans, there's sort of also a myth that, well, all these American writers were provincial. I mean, they were extremely influenced by, knowledgeable about European and others, incidentally, broader even traditions. They themselves were read over there. Longfellow's translation of Dante was thought to be, a really interesting and fine English language translation. I mean, it's striking. I think there's a little bit of a myth about how isolated we were from developments elsewhere. I think that's true of something you know more about than I, probably a bit of American Jewish history too, where there's a lot of interaction with Jewish communities abroad, both ways, I'd say, in terms of the effect and the lessons and what is to be learned from the fate of Jews here. And that's very early, right? I mean, people show up here in 1848 and so forth. It's not as if people only show up across the Atlantic in 1905 or something, when my personal, grandparents and great-grandparents showed up.
So our society rests on foundational values. Some of them are very admirable and others not so much. What are one or two of the values that are worth doubling down on?
So I think that's a good point. I was just reading something that mentioned a book that I read in college, and by a professor who just finished teaching at Harvard when I got there, Lewis Hartz. I think it's called The Liberal Tradition in America. And it's a very good book, and it sort of makes the point that America has this one big tradition, the liberal tradition. And it's been much discussed and argued about by historians and political theorists, ever since. But someone made this point just in passing that, well, there are other traditions in America that are less admirable, kind of authoritarian traditions, you might say, obviously racially prejudiced traditions and exclusionary traditions of all kinds. And we can't whitewash those away. And they're real. It's not as if these are, we do tend to talk of these often as, well, there's these European traditions that are bad, but then there's the American tradition that is good. It's more complicated than that. Having said that, whatever our hypocrisies and our limitations, I do think it's important and rare that the dominant, you might say, American public tradition, at least, has been, let's call it a liberal tradition in Hartz's sense, of one of government by consent of the governed and equal rights. And even when violated in pretty egregious ways, there was an ability here to say, wait a second, this is violating our own principles. And that's a very important thing that was very important for reformers of all kinds to be able to say. So I would say, for me, it comes down to the two that are in the Declaration, to secure these rights, so securing rights, governments are instituted based on the consent of the governed. Securing rights, consent of the governed, if you want to think of it that way, kind of a twofold thing. The purpose of government is to make sure people can live in liberty, and then we can endlessly debate about how much of a support liberty needs and curbs on liberty for the sake of liberty, and you can't shut fire in a crowded theater, but whatever. But I mean, securing liberty fundamentally on the one hand, and then government by consent of the governed, which is basically elections and the freedom to run for office, and election a system that fairly administers elections and so forth on the other. And again, there are all kinds of qualifications, and we don't elect every position, and we have a Supreme Court that's appointed and confirmed by the Senate, and that's all argued for in the Federalist and discussed and worth debating. But basically, elections on the one hand and rights on the other.
And are there one or two of our sort of foundational values that are holding us back from the necessary progress we need to make as a country?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, certainly there are foundational, traditions, you might say, and practices that are holding us back. I mean, race being the most obvious, but also a certain kind of maybe the blindness to the dangers. I think this is something, Lincoln spoke about this way back when, and it remains true that we are maybe too confident that having gotten started in a pretty good way and having progressed mostly since then in a better way, you might say, on some of these issues, that all will be well. There's a kind of progressive view, you might say, that you just have to keep going in the same direction, and I don't quarrel with that maybe as a goal, but I think it's not alert enough to the chances of falling back, the chances of some of our traditions being distorted in ways that can really be damaging. Religion, let's say, I've generally been an advocate, and I think you too probably have, a friendly view, you might say, towards religion in the public square, and respect for religion as contributing to liberal democracy, which it has in so many ways. But there's no question, if you look at human history, that religion can be a force, can be appropriated to be a force on the other side. We might argue that's not, authentic religion or the best kind of religion, but whatever, people think it is. And you see a fair amount of that in the last few years, I would say. So, I do think having a more complex and sort of skeptical view of some of these traditions, probably than people on my side, on the conservative side, have had over, I just speak about that for the last 20, 30, 40 years, a kind of understanding that so many things in life, this is a conservative point actually, most goods aren't unalloyed goods and they have downsides. And we've seen the downsides of some of the kind of patriotism, which on the whole is a healthy thing. And, deference, you might almost say, to people who say they're from a major religious tradition. That's on the whole not an unhealthy thing, probably, but better than bigotry against that tradition. But, at times it can also be exploited by unscrupulous or just foolish people. So I think a little more, self-examination and skepticism would be a good thing.
So I'm glad you mentioned religion, because that brings me to the next question. Most of our constitutional guarantees emphasize our commonality. They may protect individual rights and offer individual responsibilities, but they're collective in nature. But the very first freedom in the Bill of Rights is very personal: religion, freedom of conscience. Are there values that are rooted in your personal belief system that you would commend to people who don't necessarily share those beliefs?
And I think religious freedom is so important, and it is a subset of general freedom because it also implies freedom for non-believers. And indeed, the Constitution goes out of its way to say no religious test. And I very much deplore the kind of exploitation of religion where people allied an argument that, the Bible has been important in America and should be respected, to the Bible is the basis of America, to Christianity is the basis of America, to we're allowed to discriminate against other religions. And you've seen a lot of that over the last few years, unfortunately. But I think a lot, something like religious freedom or freedom of belief, let's just call it, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, all those First Amendment freedoms. I think it's pretty easy to make the case. It shouldn't be that hard to make the case that, look, we have a duty to respect those freedoms. We also just have a basic self-interest, since we can't be sure that our particular beliefs are going to be the dominant or majority ones, in having all of us respect those freedoms. Tyranny of the majority or oppression of the majority are real possibilities in a democracy, and non-democracies too, of course, and but also in democracies. And so, I think that is a very important argument to make. And I do think one thing that's happened, certainly on the right, maybe a little bit on the left too, in the last several years, is a kind of, you take for granted all that you like about liberal democracy, and then you dislike certain things. And so you just are willing to cut away at all the basic protections for liberty in the service of your own particular, wishes or likes or dislikes. And that's really dangerous. I mean, just getting people to reminding people of how, ugly and nasty the world can turn and nations can turn pretty suddenly. And therefore, the value of these protections, which we tend to take for granted. I mean, it's very much like anything else, right? Red lights and green lights, and they're all over the place, and they're kind of annoying sometimes if you're at some light, there's no traffic. But you know what? If you had a society that didn't have basic respect for traffic lights, you would have a lot of problems. And I think we don't have enough respect for just these basic kind of protections of our safety and security and liberty.
How do you think our society should be pursuing our national purpose right now?
Look, I mean, one thing about living in a large society with limited government, which is good, I think, is that the government has a real role to play, the federal government. State and local governments have a role to play. But civil society, religious organizations, civic organizations, businesses, universities, all have roles to play, and some can fall down on the job a little bit, and others can step up more. So if you look at American history, I don't know if anyone's really written about it quite in this way, but you could argue that, there are times when different institutions have done better and different institutions have done worse. Now, the kind of worst scenario is when a lot of institutions do worse together, So let's say the South in the 1920s or before that, of course, also the 1880s, 90s, where you had sort of government going in the wrong direction in terms of basic respect for equal rights, and an awful lot of private sector institutions going in the wrong direction, a lot of religious institutions going in the wrong direction. And that's obviously the most dangerous case. It is an argument for pluralism, though. You want to have a lot of different centers of power and authority and responsibility and wealth, even in a society, to sort of check things when one or two institutions go wrong. So I think the decentralization and sort of dispersal of authority and power is very important. And I've gotten maybe even more convinced of that over the last several years. A president that I didn't like and thought was trying to do a lot of bad things didn't do as many of them as he might have done because universities said, no, I'm sorry, we're not going to, follow your lead and kick out the dreamers. And churches said, we're not going to follow your lead and teach hostility towards everyone who seeks to come to this country and so forth. I remember I was on TV, we were both here in Virginia, after Charlottesville in 2017. And I was on a panel, and someone said, oh, we need a president everyone was disappointed in Trump. We need a president who's going to stand up and say the right thing. And I said, and I think this was correct, that, look, I personally at that point had given up on hoping for too much from Donald Trump. But luckily, we're in America. If the president doesn't say the right thing, senators and governors can say the right thing. And the mayors can say the right thing, and religious leaders can say the right thing. And I think actually in Charlottesville, which I followed pretty closely, and I'm sure you did, a lot of people did actually say the right thing and do the right thing right afterwards. And in a way, the right lessons were learned, mostly, I would say, from that, without much presidential leadership. So I think it's a good reminder that in a country like ours, there are many opportunities for leadership, not just the person in the Oval Office.
That's great. And how about the individual? What role does the individual play in pursuing our national purpose?
I mean, a crucial role, because it's a free country, and so people can pursue it in our national purpose, their own purposes in many, many ways. And most people, most of the time, are going to be busy pursuing their families, their communities' purpose, and that's totally fine. I would say, in fact, together, this creates a healthy and flourishing nation. So you don't want everyone, being a political activist or even running a public interest group. You want an awful lot of people inventing things that will make life better for people, and a lot of physicians helping their patients and so forth. So professors teaching their students. So I am a believer in this kind of diversity and pluralism, and not trying to hector everyone that they have to all be concerned about the public sphere or current politics, certainly, 24/7. I think that would be bad, actually, for the country. Having said that, obviously there are times when people we are all citizens, and we all do need to think some about our common interests and keeping the whole system, so to speak, healthy, in addition to whatever part of it we're focused on. And obviously, different times in one's life, one has more ability or less ability to do that. Different people, frankly, have more ability and less ability just because of, their resources or their influence or their good luck or something, whether where they're living, whether not, or bad luck where they're living, in terms of influencing things. So, I don't think there's not a one size fits all answer to this, but yeah, I do think we've been. I know a lot of people say we've been too individualistic. We haven't focused on our common interests and responsibilities. There's probably some truth to that. On the other hand, so we're speaking at the very end of August, about to finish the Afghan withdrawal, whatever one thinks of that. What's really been amazing is the number of communities, individuals, business leaders, faith leaders who have stepped up here and on their own really organized efforts, everything from getting people out, which has been very, retired former veterans, former people who served, working with others to do pretty amazing things, maybe things the government should be doing, but isn't quite able to do. But much more, obviously, helping people who have shown up here in terms of, getting them just resources and getting them settled and helping, find places for them to live and so forth. And that's, it's amazing how much of that doesn't happen through government. I'm not trying. I sort of vaguely knew about this, obviously. I've been around and watched the resettlement of people from Vietnam. I'm a little bit involved, as we all were, in helping refuseniks and people who were Jews who left the former Soviet Union, but both the Soviet Union, when it was the Soviet Union, and then afterwards in 1990, 91, I guess, to get located. And most synagogues did things on their own. And sometimes government helped a little bit, from federal or state or local, sometimes not so much. But the degree to which people have just sort of stepped up and understood that they need to do things And it's been a good reminder of sort of the health of civil society in the U.S. And you don't want government to, you'd like government to do the key things it has to do and can do best, but we do have a pretty impressive, I would say, civic society in that respect. So that sort of cheers me up when I get depressed about our politics in Washington.
So, it's interesting, Bill, that I've talked to a lot of people about these questions, and the people to the left who have often emphasized very strongly the importance of individual expression have been much less encouraging of that individual expression than I just heard from you in the last few minutes. It's curious to me. Not good or not bad, but just very interesting. Here's my last question to you. Are you optimistic about America's future?
Yes, actually. I hate to even say I'm optimistic because, it seems like it can be wishful thinking. I have a friend who says, he's always pessimistic because then if things go badly, you can say I was right, I was intelligent about this. And if things go well, you can be pleasantly surprised. So maybe it's better to have my father used to call himself a cheerful pessimist. And I think that's kind of what he meant by that you're probably safer being pessimistic, but you shouldn't be dour pessimist, and you can be cheerful and hopeful. I am actually pretty optimistic because for all the problems we've had, you look around this country, the innovation, the leadership we've retained and maybe have increased in some ways. No one predicted that so much, I think, in some of the technological breakthroughs, which I think mostly will be for good. The vaccine's a pretty amazing achievement, and it's a global achievement. And I think it has real lessons, incidentally, about the importance of, globalism, to use a term that is usually used in a negative way, but I would use it in a positive way. Immigrants, incidentally, contributed so much to that. I've become much more liberal. I never was that conservative on this issue, but I've become much more liberal on immigration, which I think has been such a key to American success for 2 centuries, very much in accord with the principles, incidentally, of the Declaration of the Federalists, and somewhat anticipated there, even though at that moment in 1789, there weren't that many immigrants coming over and all that. It wasn't that easy to do. But the degree to which it's so consistent with the spirit of America and has so refreshed the spirit of America at so many times, and I think it's been a huge advantage of ours over other nations. If you had to step back, through a 30,000 foot perspective and say, why has America been so successful? Immigration would have to be very high on the list. I'm not sure that everyone here was so much more brilliant than anyone anywhere else. Quite the contrary. And I always like to say this, people yearn for the good old days in America when, I don't know, they think colleges were much better once upon a time. One reason they were so much better is they were full of immigrants, who came here fleeing, unfortunately, Europe. And those people took what was not often a great system of higher education and made it the best in the world, or, their students did and so forth. So I think, so for all those reasons, as long as we stick to these basic principles and protect the system of government we have, I am pretty optimistic.
Great. Well, thank you for all of these insights. I am really pleased and honored to have this conversation with you and to include you in the quorum of discussants from all different perspectives. And thanks to our listeners for engaging with us in exploring the American purpose. It's been an honor and a pleasure to spend this time with William Kristol, who shared his perspective so generously. You can listen to this and other episodes at AmericanPurpose.org and learn more about our work at stateofbelief.com and interfaithalliance.org. Interfaith Alliance has produced this program under the guidance of Ray Kirstein. I am Jack Moline, encouraging you to live with purpose.